So thank you for joining us, Kurt and Joyce, and I'll have you just each introduce yourself briefly and share a bit about your career journey and what brought you to the role you're at today. So maybe Kurt, if we can start with you.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm Kurt Kipka, and I'm the VP of Programs at Apparel Impact Institute. My career path, well, I did undergrad, management background, and then I got my MBA at Carlson School of Business here in Minnesota, where I live. But my career path is a bit more business oriented. I started in sourcing at Target Corporation, followed a traditional career path there, up the ranks to a buyer or sourcing manager. I started a sourcing sustainability team. So the type of work that we're discussing today, I started the strategy for the Target Corporation while I was there, and then joined the Natural Resource Defense Council, NGO, with offices all over the world, but primary offices in the Bay Area, DC, and New York City. That's where I led a program that is one of the most prominent ones that we'll talk about today if we get into that level of detail. Once I left NRDC, or at least while I was at NRDC, I was tasked with finding a long-term home for some of the work that we were doing in the apparel textile supply chain, and that's what landed me at AII. Now I lead a number of programs like what I did at NRDC with a look at the apparel textile supply chain and extending some of my efforts beyond this particular industry as well.
Thanks so much. That's great. And Kurt and I have known each other for, I think, over a decade now, actually, starting from the early days of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And Kurt is being modest about his work in the past. I would say he was really one of the leaders in bringing the original Higg Index facility environment module out to the suppliers, the Target supply chain. So really instrumental in building that tool from the start. And Joyce is my former colleague at VF Corporation. So Joyce handled all of the facility level impact work while I was focused on the materials and products impact side, but we were on the same sustainability team there. And Joyce is now with Sustainable Apparel Coalition. So Joyce, a bit about your background and what brought you to your current role as well would be great. And thank you for joining us from, are you still in Hong Kong? I should confirm.
Yeah, I'm in Hong Kong, yes.
Yeah, awesome, great.
Yes. Yeah, nice to see you, Beth, and thank you for inviting me to speak to your students. Hello, everybody. So what brought me into my role? I have quite a long career journey, around 20 years. I've been on different roles, doing my thesis, my PhD thesis is on supply chain sustainability back in 2005. So I have quite a long journey researching on supply chain sustainability, where I still remember I visited the first factory with Patagonia. That was my first doing social compliance audit. I've been conducting around, I think, more than 200 social compliance audit and environmental audit, I think, in the last 20 years. I've been on, lecturing on supply chain sustainability, business ethics, and CSR, corporate social responsibility in the UK. And my background, I would say I'm an engineer by background, quite technical person, starting with, chemical engineering is all about making chemicals. We let all the pollutants, and I wonder why we have to deal with all the pollutants at first. And then I got into environmental engineering, how we fix the problem. So wastewater treatment, how do we deal with water processes? And then I was rethinking, how do we do it not producing pollution? So that's why I was doing my PhD on, environmental management. During the last 20 years, academic roles and lecturer in Brunel University in the UK, Imperial College in the UK, and then also currently the senior lecturer at University of Hong Kong, doing, teaching students about the importance of environmental management system, the importance of resource management and efficiency in our supply chain. And then also working with a consultant called UL. So UL does a lot of, I was being in flying back to Hong Kong at that time, 10 years ago, with the role that developing global environmental program for clients. So MS Sports, Patagonia, the Electronic Industry Coalition, EICC, which now is the Resource Business Alliance, Responsible Business Alliance, and then and then moving on to two very internal roles. So working for H&M first, leading the external environmental initiative, engagement with zero discharge of hazardous chemicals, being a board member in CDXC for 2 years, working with WWF on pioneering what a collective action looks like in China and Bangladesh. Also working with Kurt on Apparel Impact Institute, and at that time I believe it was on NRDC. Also known Kurt and Beth for some time, I would say about a decade. And then moving on to a second role with Beth on VF, managing the global supply chain sustainability work, supporting our global supply chain on rolling out the HIC index, measuring environmental impact of our supply chain, also working with Kurt on reducing environmental impact on multiple countries along the supply chain, improving energy efficiency, with suppliers and training the suppliers, how important it is to reduce, your impact in your facilities, the benefits of that and business case. So that was, and then moving on to my 2 months on my new role with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, where my heart lies. How do we drive bigger impact, systematic impact at large? How do we scale this? Because climate change is really, we need to take action now, not later. Because this is something that is irreversible, and what we do now, it's we need to get everybody together to drive this systematic impact rather than by individual company. That would not be fast enough to mitigate climate change and build climate resilience. So I will stop there, Beth.
Thank you. That's great, Joyce. And in your new role as Director of Collective Action Programs is really synergistic with Kurt and AII, of course, with that organization being focused really solely on that driving that collective action in the industry at the supply chain, at the supplier level in particular. So Kurt, can you talk a little bit more about the Apparel Impact Institute specifically, and maybe even a bit of history about how it was formed and what you're working on now, kind of what some of your key programs are, just for a little bit of context? Oh,
Muted.
Thank you.
Apparel Impact Institute. We like to say that we identify, fund, and scale impact programming for the industry. Starting in stage 1, identify, it's finding the best possible solutions and projects that exist in this industry with a focus on delivering quantifiable impact reductions. And just to be clear, when it comes to impact reductions, in the way that we define it at AII, it's quantifiable energy reductions, water reductions, chemicals that are being removed from the production processes. Moving on from identify, what are those best solutions for the facilities that we work with to improve themselves, funding them. And we applied several different mechanisms for funding those projects, which in our case brings together 3 central sources of funding, both as it relates to implementation projects. So think of replacing machinery at a facility as one category of funding. And then there's the programmatic side, the teaching, the learning, application side of the work in order to operate new machinery effectively, or to make the retrofit, or to sign off on the retrofit at that given location, representing one portion of the funding that we do. So there's the industry funding, that is the brands, manufacturers with an interest in funding the activities that are going to improve production processes. There's a NGO or philanthropic community as well that is interested in funding new research and development of initiatives within the supply chain or around the world generally. And then there's the banks, there's financiers who are interested in lending in this space. AII applies unique models for the most proven solutions in this industry for organizations who want to improve their performance, who want to develop new and interesting techniques, and who want to finance those programs. And then scale. The third mechanism is identifying those solutions that can be brought to new regions, new locations, expanded outside of this sector, or even going deeper into the supply chain. As Beth has described, there's a number of different tiers in this supply chain. Typically, the traditional relationship of a brand to their supply chain is at that tier one, the first point of interaction. Over the course of the last 10 years, we've seen expansion into subsequent tiers of the supply chain, all the way down to tier four, as Beth described. The challenge is, as you get further and further along that supply chain, it becomes more opaque and more challenging to get clarity on what's happening at those locations within the supply chain, and a brand or even a development agency begins to lose leverage or influence with those locations. So AII, as a collective impact programming facilitator, we create co-ops of brands, funders, and philanthropic organizations in order to facilitate on-the-ground programs where not one organization individually has influence to bring them forward, but collectively there's a cumulative voice that brings those types of projects to the forefront. So my work really historically has focused on tier two of the supply chain, which that graphic that Beth flashed up earlier from the WRI report, which actually was in partnership with my organization AII, you can see the tier two is where a large proportion of the carbon within this industry lies. The same goes for water and wet processing that happens at that layer of the supply chain. So even dating back to my days at Target, we went to tier two because that's where the impact was. There's a saying that you refer to as Sutton's Law, who Willie Sutton was an old bank robber. And when they asked him, why do you rob banks? He said, well, that's where the money is. Well, why do we go to tier two, to material production? Because that's where the impact is. And so historically, that's where a number of our programs begin. But as I described, we start to look at applications of those processes and bring them out to tier one and tier three. Now, one thing that I just want to make very clear about our organization is that we're not a technology organization. We're more of the convening organization, where we have partners like Beth's organization, like Joyce's organization. We're often hearing voices from partners in the industry, from some of the leading brands in the industry, that we'd like to take on this project. And by bringing together those voices of like-minded individuals or organizations, ultimately we can drive down the overall programmatic cost, so that one brand, one organization isn't toting the bill for an entire project that basically the industry itself benefits from, especially as you get further and further into the supply chain. The processes that are happening at each location are spread further and further, or split more and more among different users of those production facilities. And so, as being one central point of contact that Apparel Impact Institute and organizations like us can be, we can be that convening body in order to drive down overall programmatic costs, but also to be a voice for the manufacturers involved and the local partners that are invested in bringing these programs to the forefront. And I guess maybe one thing that we can get into subsequently is where this is happening, but you know, perhaps Joyce, your background is just as well suited for sharing. The typical program is happening in this industry. You're looking at mainland China, India, Vietnam, Bangladesh. Joyce named a couple of those countries. Italy. It's kind of interesting. Our organization, just for the first time over the last couple of years, has started to do implementation projects within the US. Although this work has been carried out in the industry for more than 10 years, it's for the first time in the last couple of years that we've started to actually look at apparel production that's happening here. So that just gives you a sense of the majority of the production that's happening in this sector is happening abroad. And therefore, there's further complicating factors that come with cultural nuance, language nuance, and barriers. But ultimately, when you get down to the engineering background of implementing the kinds of activities that we bring forward, that's really where we start to see the standardization that's necessary across this industry for driving the necessary reductions, hopefully by 2030.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And actually that's a really great segue. I was just going to ask Joyce if, putting your AII participant hat back on, maybe can you provide a bit of an example of one of the projects that you participated in with VF through Apparel Impact Institute, and why it was valuable to do that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I would say we've putting back my head on VF, we've been, I think, working with a lot of our suppliers. I think more than a dozen suppliers a year since 2018, working with Kurt and his team, working on first to engage with the suppliers, why this program would be beneficial for you. It will take a while for them to get buy-in and understand how we actually choose the suppliers. So VF has a very long supply chain. I would say we have around more than 1,000 suppliers. So how do we choose? We will not be able to choose to work with 1,000 suppliers. So we typically choose the ones that are important for our business, and we look at I keep mentioning the HIC data, HIC facility environmental module. Basically, it's within the HIC suite of tools, which belongs to the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. So we look at who are the important suppliers, which are strategic suppliers. So we rank the suppliers based on business volume, based on long-term business, based on whether the suppliers has a long-term goal, which is very similar to VF. We look at the potential for expanding that business with each supplier. So we also look at sustainability data. So sustainability data, we would look at the HIC environmental performance data, what the score looks like, what's the impact in terms of water, air, chemicals, energy and greenhouse gas emission, waste. So we look at all sorts of this data and determine who are the most impactful. So as Kurt already mentioned, tier 2 would be the most impactful. So for Chinese suppliers, we have a lot of large Chinese suppliers who are supplying fabric and footwear materials in China. So what we do is we look at their environmental HIC data, we look at the business importance, we look at, after talking to the suppliers, do they have the right resources and, commitment to reduce environmental impact? So we look at a couple of this factor to be able to choose the suppliers, to engage with the suppliers. So first, I think in the journey of getting the suppliers on board and then kick off the program, and then AII would typically provide a lot of expert support on screening the suppliers where they are at, and so collecting a bunch of data also with the data from the HIC index. And then we go on the assessment. So there typically would be an assessment on site. So the expert will walk around with the suppliers and the VF team on site to look at different manufacturing process, to talk to the management, to talk to the workers, how they manage different things, how do they manage machinery, how do they manage the manufacturing process, the boiler, the utility room, what are the energy sources they are using. And then after the walk around, an expert will actually propose a series of action items. Some are no cost, some are medium cost, some are high cost. So there will be an action plan coming out from the assessment. And then we explain to the suppliers, what are the immediate low cost items, and it's so we sort of agree on what are the items time frame you need to commit to, and then the VF team, we also support the suppliers on a monthly basis to check in if there's any progress, if there's any technical difficulties that we can resolve for you, any questions. So we will be training the suppliers on a monthly basis along the way to support the factories. And we also will be, working with the AI team to understand and manage the process, anything the suppliers would need. And then we will also reflect that to the AI team for support. And then there will also, the suppliers will be going on the sort of training on energy efficiency. How do they have a better energy or chemical management system or water management system in-house? And the team on the ground will also support the suppliers on building those management system or how tracking system works along the way. So after 1 year of implementation of interventions, we will typically evaluate the impact on what interventions has been implemented, what the results looks like, what are the savings, what are the payback time, what has already been achieved, how much energy you have saved. So we will build a business case and also share with other suppliers on what has been done, and there are actually business case, and we will also share with internally with the business team so that they understand that this is we're working with the suppliers, these are the benefits, and we would encourage more suppliers to join the AII program. So that is typically the cycle of how we execute the program on a yearly basis.
Thank you. That is super helpful, just to provide a specific example from a company that's been very actively involved in the AII project. It'd be great to just touch on, I think often when people think about factories, apparel or footwear or sporting goods factories, you think about cut and sew factories, you think about tier one. And it's until you get into this field, I think a lot of people don't have as much visibility to what's happening in tier two or tier three and what those challenges really are. So I guess one of my foundational questions to start is just in general, what do you both feel like are the biggest challenges or barriers that are faced by the industry related to reducing impacts at the factory level, and why? So another way to think about this is, if you were able to wave a magic wand, what would you do? And if you can draw in some challenges specific to tier two or tier three in this answer, I think that'd be really helpful to the students, because again, I think that's often not as not as easily addressed if you're not deep in the weeds in this in the industry, or not as easily found in media, et cetera, or good explanations of what's happening deeper in the supply chain. So Kurt, maybe I'll start with you.
I can get us started. So when we're talking about tier two, I to this day, I still could not effectively describe to this group how large some of these production facilities are. I grew up in a small town. We're talking about facilities that are 20, 30, 40, 50 times the size of a city, 10,000, 15,000 people working in one location all at one time. Massive production sites that unless you're there, it's really hard to understand or comprehend what all this material is even being used for. And that starts to get your mind around, realistically, just how big the apparel sector is globally. So with that in mind, just to make one small change in those facilities is a massive undertaking. To get the right connection, to get the right person on the project, to be able to get the attention of the appropriate decision makers can be half the challenge. Joyce recently spoke about the recruitment process. Well, part of that recruitment process is getting somebody at that location who understands what you're talking about to then convey their thoughts to the person who can pay the fee or pay the ticket for how much needs to be invested in the project. So just mapping that process in of itself can be a massive challenge. Not to mention, with that volume or with that size of a production site comes massive volume and thus massive revenue as well. And so we're talking about highly complex and sophisticated businesses that are primarily driven by driving revenue and driving profits for their organization. And even though many of the interventions, many of the projects that we would propose to them have relatively immediate returns on investment or payback periods, it's still a challenge to route funding or relatively small finances towards efficiency or environmental related projects away from potentially revenue driving or profit driving activities like starting a new production line or adding a new capability at that production site. So this is kind of one, a long way of saying the complexities come with the very volume of this industry, but then also the competing factors that really any business owner, whether it's in this sector or any sector, is competing with, even when it comes to value driving activities. And I think just relating that to your daily lives, we all want to be efficient. We all want to make the right decisions, but it comes down to a matter of convenience in so many cases, of just how far I'm willing to go as an individual to be an efficient person or to be sustainable in my everyday practices. And that becomes even more challenging when you're managing an operation that is the scale of many of these production sites.
Yeah, that's great, Kurt. I think that's a really good sort of anecdote to weave into this, right? It's just the scale that is not necessarily something that people realize right off the bat. If you haven't been to China, for example, and seen the factories and dormitories as far as the eye can see, and that's the reality of production today. And so just recognizing the scale of that is great. Joyce, how about you? Biggest challenges and barriers faced by the industry related to facility level impacts? Yeah,
I think first I have to, probably there are a lot of challenges, and challenges is not necessarily bad. I think challenges can means we have a lot of opportunities to improve. I think the first big one is traceability. I think our industries is, compared to the electronic industries, I would say our industry is more decentralized. So traceability is, a lot of the brand and retailers, they really don't know beyond their tier one, like who are their tier twos, who are their tier three, who are their tier fours. I think this is the biggest, by far, the challenge. So I think traceability, you have got to know where your impacts are. You need to map, who are you working with, where the productions are located. So this is, I think, the biggest challenge. First, you need to tackle, right? So where your impacts are, because if you don't know where your impacts are, you need to measure. You're not going to put a program. You don't know where to put a program in place even. So first, I think getting your supply chain traceable and transparent is the first step. I think there are also a couple of other challenges, as Kurt also mentioned about, getting factories to buy in, because different factories, their technical person, management person, they have a different view. A lot of these business people, of course, that they might want to make sure their business is profitable. And you will, you can see from the last couple of years, because of COVID, the suppliers are basically making sure that their business, they have enough cash to run their business. So we face a lot of challenge actually in the past, I would say 2 to 3 years, to get the factories to invest, especially for medium to long-term interventions. I would say those are, for example, changing your dyeing machine for tier 2 facilities. So the way that tier 2 works is you have to go through a series of processes, from preparing the materials, desizing, you need to use a lot of water for washing and dyeing processes, and also printing and other processes. So there's a series of processes. So I think getting the management buy-in, it's something that that the industry needs to bring higher awareness to factory owners and CEO, to get their buy-in. As I mentioned about it's especially in the last few years, it's difficult to get the factories even to invest in, joining the program. There's a fee, and the brands, we will be supporting half of the cost. And ultimately, a lot of these interventions are paid by the owners or of the companies. So they're being a bit hesitant about, the current situation, the uncertainty of the business. Partly also because they see, they cannot see medium to long term if their factory is going to be relocated. We have been doing a lot of work when I was in VF, pushing a lot of these long-term interventions like renewable energy. So typically for renewable energy to be, profitable, to be actually, there's a long payback time for the adoption of renewable energy. Typically, the payback time would be around 15 to 20 years. For some other countries, it might be shorter, depends on also the policy framework of each individual countries. So in order to push for long-term interventions, I think, not only do the factory needs to have a more long-term business plan, that they understand that they will be locating in the same location. And the policy, actually the government, if they are actually promoting renewable energy or promoting cleaner production, that's also another factors that would motivate the facilities. I would say, for example, in China, there is a cleaner production policy, and each of the highly polluted we call the highly key pollution units, they would need to meet the cleaner production targets each year. So they would need to submit data to the government saying that how much energy has been reduced, how much water and wastewater they have been discharging and using. And China also has a quite strict, on a provincial level, how much greenhouse gas you can reduce, and how much energy you and coal use you can use per year. So it actually depends a lot on country policy. For example, in Cambodia, we look at renewable energy. Actually, it's very profitable, I would say, for factories in Cambodia to have renewable energy, because this is because the energy produced by the grid is quite high in terms of kilowatt hour. But the government actually, they have a policy, only half of the energy consumption can be coming from renewable solar, for example, solar panel. So it makes it hard to sort of, implementing the factories with full 100% renewable energy. And you will be, getting penalized because your factory is 100% renewable. So you will need to pay a standard fee if you go beyond that 50% threshold. So I would say promoting, policy awareness and advocacy is very important in each of these production countries to make sure that, you have renewable energy access and there is sufficient technology and resources to support the facilities.
Okay, a couple more questions. Kurt, one for you. What are just some brief examples from your perspective of brand leadership in the area of factory level impacts?
Yeah, I think when it comes to brand leadership, Joyce touched on this. Traceability is key. It's just knowing all the way back to tier 4 what's happening in the supply chain. And that can even start with one given product, a t-shirt. And Patagonia has done a ton of work on that. Their traceability that they post on their website is incredible. They'll provide you with a link back to where a lot of their garments are produced, but also where the materials associated with it came from as well. And then with that, the data along those touch points of traceability becomes a key point of the work that ultimately needs to be done. And so when it comes to leaders, you've touched on some of them already and introduced them to this class, but I look to the Patagonias of the world, the Nikes of the world, the Colombias, who are, I think, swinging above their weight class in this field. And then REIs, there's some really great examples within the outdoor industry of organizations who are taking traceability, but then also the data along that supply chain to the next level in terms of the impact that they can have as an organization, both as one solitary organization influencing their suppliers, but then also working collectively with organizations like SAC, like AII on the type of projects that are going to help elevate the industry overall.
Great, great. And is there a specific project that you would say or a specific sort of intervention at the factory level that you would say is really leading right now?
Yeah, I think what's really exciting right now, and this is getting really geeky when
That's
it comes
okay.
to the
Get
work
geek.
that we do.
Fine. Do
um,
it.
so at tier two, I'll try to keep this as simple as possible. One of the biggest reasons why it's so impactful and so rich with the potential for emissions reductions is that there's a use of thermal energy that's needed in the material production process, meaning that there's a very large need in the way that the materials are made to use high heat steam or high heat water that can only be produced currently in most cases with fossil fuels. In most cases, in developing countries, that's with coal boilers that are on site at those production facilities. In some cases, there's progress towards using natural gas on site for those boilers. So some of the more exciting work that we're doing right now is beginning to really hone in on that thermal energy need that can't be reproduced with renewable energy currently, and looking at some really exciting alternatives, or the potential for exciting alternatives, using things like aggregated solar that's an array of mirrors that's going to concentrate energy into the form that it's needed for creating the high flash steam and high temperature water needed for production. There's also on the horizon hydrogen as a fuel source for this industry. And then there's just production process updates and retrofits that could also be game changing for this industry as well. So what we see as one of the biggest needs from an impact reduction standpoint also is one of the biggest opportunities for improvement in this industry. If we could crack that nut, we would make a lot of progress in the most impactful tier of the supply chain. And organizations working on that are some that I've named, but I would add other organizations like Lululemon, American Eagle, CNA. There's a number of companies who have identified this as a need for the industry and the perfect fit for collective impact programming, because there's really no clear answer, and there may not be a clear answer for the industry if we can apply site-specific methodologies or site-specific methods that might be geographically focused, or where solar may not be available aggregated in one place. Biomass may be more readily available. It's really going to take a coordinated kind of if-then scenario approach to that sector of the supply chain to address one of the biggest needs that we have for this industry.
Awesome. That's great. And one more question for you, Joyce. So I just wanted to introduce the students a bit to this concept of equal partnership that we've talked about quite a lot over the years in the Sustainable Apparel Coalition discussions and just in general in the industry discussions. So would you mind just providing a bit more context to the group on what equal partnership is and why it's, it'll become clear why it's so important, but just a bit more about that term and concept for the group. That'd be great.
Yeah, sure, Beck. So equal partnership, it's basically one of the principles how we operate at Sustainable Apparel Coalition. What it means is, so in our Sustainable Apparel Coalition, we have a lot of members in our organization. So we have brand and retailers, large and small, from large size, multi-billion dollars, companies like Walmart or Nike or VF or CNA, so we have a lot of these type of, we are called the corporate members. So large and small, we have small members as well, small size retailers. We have suppliers and manufacturers and raw materials suppliers in the coalition. We have affiliate members. So we have, service providers. We have government members, we have academics, we have the nonprofit organizations. So we have basically a coalition of different stakeholders in the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. So what we want to do is, our principle is equal opportunity, equal partnership. So we want to make sure that everyone can express their view equally. It doesn't mean that, you know, you are a big company, your voice is bigger. So we want to make sure that you know, the voices from smaller companies or academics or government or NGOs, their voices, you know, they can express their sort of their opinion and their you know, their view on certain things. So those views can be taken into considerations. So we try to make sure that you know, members can express their view. You know, a lot of these companies in this ecosystem, I would say in this ecosystem in terms of you know, in our membership are actually competitors, right? So we want to make sure that we run on a non-competitive basis, and we don't cite whoever, you know, you say this, you're very powerful, you know, you are from a very powerful companies. So we want to make sure that we listen to the voices of our members, and making sure no matter their size, their history, who who are more influential, we make sure that they are treated equally. So that's our principle, how we operate in the organization.
Yep, that's great, Joyce. And I would add to that, I think just from the history of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and how these efforts have evolved throughout the industry, I would add that I think that concept really started specifically with the brand to supplier relationship, and just making sure that suppliers have an equal voice in interventions and projects and programs, and, you know, working toward, you know, impact reduction targets and so forth. Making sure that suppliers really have an equal voice and are leading many of those efforts, you know, in the same way that I think often in the past, it had been the case where brands were often really leading and driving some of those things, and not really approaching that with an equal mindset. And so really some years ago, this became a hot topic of discussion within the Sustainable Apparel Coalition meetings, and which include brands and suppliers, and as Joyce said, companies of all sizes, and all different types of stakeholders in the industry. And so now that concept has really been embedded, I think, throughout all of this work in the industry, and something that gets talked about often in numerous different contexts, and just making sure that everyone who has a stake in any of this really has an equal opportunity to, you know, bring their voice to the table and lead projects and so forth. And particularly in the case of you know, the suppliers, who are really the ones who are, you know, executing on these efforts at the factory level.